Bloomberg News ran a story yesterday, July 15th, and here's the title. U.S. threatens to abandon IEA over green-leaning energy forecasts. And the U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who's from the oil and gas industry, runs a big oil field services company, said, we will reform the IEA the way it operates, or we will withdraw. And what that means, the IEA has members from the OECD, the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, and they all pay a fee, and that's how the IEA funds its operations. And this has been a sticking point for a long time because the IEA has been predicting peak oil demand in 2030, but then 3 weeks ago it released its oil market 2025, its forecast from now until 2030, and it lowered peak oil demand to 2029, and it said China's oil demand has peaked already and will stay flat until 2030, and then presumably after that it will begin to decline. This is bad news for the oil industry, and rather than confronting the bad news, what are we going to do about it? They're going to shoot the messenger. I find this fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is I read a lot of oil demand modeling, and I did a video about a month or so ago because Premier Danielle Smith from Alberta had said that you can't find a single credible forecast that shows peak oil demand before 2050. Well, I found 16 oil demand forecasts, and 3 of them said no, 13 of them are forecasting peak oil demand by 2030 or maybe 2032 at the latest. This is a talking point of the oil industry, and it goes back to OPEC and OPECs modeling, which shows oil demand expanding out to 2050, and the industry has picked this up as a talking point, and it is all part of their push to either delay the decline in the consumption of oil or to convince emerging countries like Africa that they need to continue to use oil instead of switching over to electricity to fuel their transportation system in particular. And the problem here is that you could have a very rational discussion about whether the IEA is right, or its scenarios are more likely than OPEC scenarios or Rystad Energy scenarios or S&P Global scenarios. I mean, literally, there's dozens of the companies that are doing this kind of modeling. And here's a key point. Models are basically, they're very sophisticated computer models, and you plug in the data and then you come up with your assumptions. And so, just to give you an example, one of the assumptions from OPEC's modeling, they assume that between now and 2050, global demand for oil in the global south will skyrocket, and demand for oil in the global north will decline. But the demand from the global south will be so strong it will overwhelm the decline from the global north, and you'll have a continued global rise up to mid-century. And the problem with that, then it assumes that the electrotech that China is manufacturing and exporting to great extent will not be competitive with fossil fuel-based technologies like the internal combustion engine and gas turbines and gas boilers and so on. That's an assumption, and as is the assumption about global South's oil demand. And here's what the IEA had to say, and this is very sensible. It said back in March 2024, it released a statement, and it said that its scenarios, quote unquote, are built on different underlying assumptions about how the energy system might evolve over time. And what the IEA is doing is looking at China as driving the electrification of the global economy. It's already electrifying its transportation at a terrific clip. It is tied into Europe. It's exporting a lot of its EVs there. And again, I mentioned, what's going on in the global south, in Latin America and Africa and Asia and elsewhere. Same process. And what we've got here is an ideological divide over energy. But at the end of the day, one is going to win and one is going to lose. And I have to tell you, after reading as much oil demand modeling as I do, and then checking it, because as a reporter, I do stories all the time, news stories, all the time. I interview global experts all the time about these very issues. And looking at the data, in my opinion, the IEA is far more accurate and far more likely to be right going forward than OPEC and Energy Secretary Wright. And why should Canadians care about this? Because Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, the CEOs in the Canadian oil and gas industry, the Alberta government, plenty of people in the federal government agree with OPEC. They agree with Energy Secretary Wright. And that is part of the drive toward Alberta's desire to get a pipeline out, a minimum of one pipeline to Prince Rupert. Ideally, they'd also like pipelines to Churchill in northern Manitoba and out to southern Ontario and maybe even the Atlantic coast, because they believe, OPEC, they believe that there's going to be so much demand that we won't, countries like Canada won't be able to keep up. The problem is, if the IEA is right, it basically scuppers their entire industry in the very near future. And here we are in Canada in 2025 on the cusp of major changes in the energy system, debating whether we should build a 1 million barrel a day pipeline, which is a huge pipeline, by the way. That's, you have to understand that the push for that pipeline and the debate around when peak oil demand will happen, when Chinese peak, all of that, it's about ideology, and it's about the desire to influence policy now, to bake in investments in oil and gas infrastructure. And those investments are generally, those assets usually last 30 to 50 years. Get them built now, because that will sustain the industry. It's not about economics. It's not about technological change. It's about the incumbents, the oil and gas incumbents, trying desperately to hang on in the face of significant structural change in the global energy system.